Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, for the last 6 months, England's NHS bosses have been warning that the health service needs more money to help it meet surging patient demand. But in his first budget, the Chancellor offered no immediate relief, and today the head of the organisation representing England's NHS trusts says hundreds of thousands of patients will have to wait longer for both emergency care and planned operations unless the government stumps up more cash. Warnings over funding are not exactly new. Back in 2014, the head of the NHS in England, Simon Stevens, published his plan for the future of the health service. In his 5-year forward view, Stevens said the NHS in England would face a funding shortfall of up to £30 billion by 2020. To bridge that gap, he said the NHS would need more money from the government, at least £8 billion extra, and that the health service could account for the rest by making £22 billion of efficiency savings. The government says it's given the health service more than it asked for, and that NHS in England will have received an extra £10 billion by 2020. But that number is disputed by NHS managers and the chair of Parliament's Health Committee, who say the figure is more like £4.5 billion, and other parts of the health and social care budget have been cut, putting pressure on the front line. Last year, 2/3 of NHS trusts in England finished the year in the red, and despite emergency bailouts from the government, the NHS is likely to record another deficit this year. Meanwhile, national targets on waiting times for A&E departments, diagnostic tests and operations are being missed month on month. This month's budget provided £2 billion for social care, but there was no new cash for the NHS, leading trusts to warn that patient care is beginning to suffer, and what is being asked of them is mission impossible. And I'm joined now by the Chief Executive of NHS Providers in England, Chris Hobson. Welcome to the programme.
Morning, Andrew.
I'll come on to the extra money you think you need to do your job properly in a minute, but part of the deal was that you had to make £22 billion in efficiency savings, not to bank that money, but to spend that money on patient care, the front line and so on. How's that going?
So last Parliament, we realised around 18 billion of productivity and efficiency savings. We're realising more this year, so we're on course to realise 3 billion this year. That's £250 million more than last year. But I think all of us in the NHS knew that the 22 billion was going to be a very, very stretching target, and we are somewhat inevitably falling short.
You are. So it was 22 billion by 2020, I think roughly was the time. We're now into 2017. It was over a 4 or 5 year period. So how much of the 22 billion would you say that you've managed to achieve?
So we realised around 3 billion last year. We'll be realising 3 billion this year, £250 million more, so 3.25 this year. So we're on course for probably something like 18, 19 billion. So
by the 2020
by the 2021 period.
So you're not that far away.
Well, the problem, Andrew, is the degree to which demand is going up. So we had record demand over the winter period, and that actually meant we've seen more people than we've ever seen before, but performance is still under real pressure.
Well, let me come on to that though. When you agreed on the 22 billion efficiency savings plus some extra money from the government, and I know there's a bit of an argument about how much that's actually worth, had you not factored in this extra demand that you saw coming over the next 3 to 4 years?
Well, so let's be very clear, Andrew, which is you referred to Simon Stevens' 5-year forward view. We all signed up to that. The 22 billion was actually a process that was run at the centre of government by the Department of Health with its arm's length bodies, NHS England and others. And it's not something that was consulted on with the NHS.
But you signed up to it.
And no, we always said the day that spending review was announced that the idea that the NHS, where cost and demand goes up by something like 4 or 5% a year, the idea that in the middle years of the Parliament we would be able to provide the same level of service when we were only getting funding increases of 1.3%, 0.4% and 0.7%, from the day, and I can show you the press release that we issued on the day,
right.
we always said there was going to be a gap and that we would not be able to deliver what was required. And
The full 22 billion, in other words.
what we said was, and again, Simon Stevens was very explicit about this at the Public Accounts Committee about 3 months ago. He said the NHS did not get what it was asked for.
You write today that the NHS cannot cope with the current resources it has. How much more do you need?
Well, so our report today is just about 2017-18, and we estimate, so what we're being asked to do, Andrew, is, again, you very clearly, I thought, set it out in the beginning package. We're currently quite a long way off the 4-hour A&E target. We're currently quite a long way off the 92%.
On the waiting times operation. So how much more do you need?
And we're also having to make up an 800 million to 900 million pound deficit. If you took all of those into account, we estimate that you would need an extra £3.5 billion next year in order to deliver all of those targets and eliminate the provider deficit.
So that would be £3.5 billion on top of what's already planned for next year, and that would be £3.5 billion repeated in the years to come too.
Yeah. So Andrew, I think it's really important that we should make an important distinction about the NHS versus other public services. When the last government, last Labour government, put in extra money into the NHS, it very clearly said that in return for that, it was going to establish some standards in the NHS constitution, the 95% A&E target that we've talked about, the 92% elective surgery target that we've talked about. The trusts that we represent are very clear. They would want to realise those standards, but you can only do it if you pay for it. And at the moment, the problem is that we're now in the longest and deepest financial squeeze in NHS history. As we've said, funding is only going up by 1% a year, but every year, just to stand still, cost and demand go up by more than 4%.
There's clearly a demand for more money, and I think people watching this programme will think probably the NHS is going to have to get more money to meet the goals that you've been given. But I think they'd also like to be sure that you're running the NHS as efficiently as it could be. We read this morning that trusts have got £100 million of empty properties. It costs £10 million to maintain. You've got 36 office blocks not being used. You have surplus land equivalent to 1,800 football pitches.
So yes, there are a number of things that we know in the NHS we need to do better, but let me remind you, Andrew, in the last Parliament we realised £18 billion worth of cost improvement gains. We're going to realise another £3 billion this year, £250 million more than last year. So these things are being tackled. But Andrew, let me just...
But having all that surplus land, why not? I mean, it's almost certainly in areas where there's a demand for housing.
Well,
because
absolutely.
So why not release it for housing? You get the money, the people get the houses, and it's a contribution and a signal that you are running NHS assets as efficiently as you can.
So Andrew, tell me if I'm going into too much detail for you, but one of the reasons as to why our trusts are reluctant to realise those land sales is because there's an assumption that the money would go back to the Treasury and it wouldn't benefit NHS trusts.
You could make a deal, couldn't you?
Well, that is part of the conversation that is going on at the moment. The issue is that we would want to ensure that if we do release land, that quite rightly the benefit, particularly in foundation trusts, which are, as you will remember, deliberately autonomous organisations, that they should keep the benefit of those land sales. But Andrew,
have you raised that with the government?
Yes, we have raised that with
the government. What do they say?
The government is in the middle of having a discussion about exactly as
they're not quite
expect.
sure to give. But we also see other examples. I was looking at one case recently, and someone on a huge salary in the NHS. It turned out that they weren't much use. They were then moved to another job, which had a huge salary, and then given almost a £200,000 payoff. People just want, as I say, I think there is a national mood for the NHS to get more money. But before you give anybody more money, you want to be sure that the money that you've got already is being properly spent, which for us is the patient at the end of the day. And yet there seem to be all these enormous salaries and payoffs.
So, Andrew, I've worked in a FTSE 100 PLC. I was on the board of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, so I've basically worked in very large organisations. I can look you completely straight in the eye and tell you that the jobs that our hospital, community, mental health and ambulance trust chief executives do are amongst the most complicated leadership roles I have ever seen. It doesn't seem to me to be unreasonable that in order to get the right quality of people, we should pay an appropriate salary. And the reality is that the salaries that are paid, they're not excessive when you're talking about managing budgets of over £1 billion a year, and you're talking about managing tens of thousands of staff.
There was one doctor working as a locum earned an extra £375,000 a year. That can't be very
Well,
efficient.
so Andrew, again, one of the problems we have in the NHS at the moment is that we have a mismatch between the number of staff that we need and actually the number of staff that are coming through the pipeline. So what's having to happen is, if you want to keep a service going, you have to use locum and agency staff.
Even at that cost?
Well, clearly you wouldn't want to pay those amounts.
But you are.
Those amounts of money. Yes, well, so Andrew, because the chief executive's choice in some of those trusts is, do I keep the service open or do I employ a locum?
Let me, well, I'm sure you could find a locum prepared to work for less than that. But let me just finish up with a big question. What indication, what hopes do you have of getting this extra $3 billion plus?
Well, I think the government's been really very clear that at the moment, for the moment, it wants to stick to the existing funding settlement it's agreed. But
there's nothing in the budget.
So can I just finish by just making one
please.
really important point,
Please.
which is this is the first time that the NHS has said, before the year has even started, that we can't deliver on those standards. And we believe, as do everyone, most people who work at the NHS, that the NHS is on a gradual slow decline. This is a very important inflection point to mark. This is the first time before the financial year starts that we're saying we can't meet the targets that we're being asked to deliver and are in the NHS constitution.
We've run out of time, but we have marked it this morning. Chris Hobson, thank you for being with me.